welcome to the Crisis Report for September 17th, 2018. I'm Penny Hess, with me is Jesse Nevel today, and we're talking about, is the U.S. Army about to invade the African community? Uhuru. Welcome, Jesse.
Uhuru. Great to be here.
So this Crisis Report, before we start, is sponsored by the African People's Solidarity Committee, the organization of white people organized under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, the organization of African people all around the world that is working for the total unification of Africa and African people everywhere, wherever they have been dispersed throughout the world. They're fighting for the return of Africa and all its resources. Something that we stand in profound solidarity with, and the organization of the African People's Solidarity Committee is white people working under the leadership with the mandate to go into the white community, organizing others to recognize our interest in a stand of reparations to the African community. So we talk about the Crisis Report based on this book by Chairman Omali Yeshitela, An Uneasy Equilibrium: The African Revolution versus Parasitic Capitalism. The chairman defines this crisis of imperialism, and he calls it the uneasy equilibrium between the past and the future, between the oppressor and the oppressed, between the colonized and the colonizer. So this defines our period of crisis that we see all around us. So.
Yes, well, I'm just really glad to be on the Crisis Report with you again today, and salute to all of our viewers. And I know today we're talking about this thing that was in the news recently, where last Monday night, people living in the residential neighborhood of Maryland Heights in St. Louis reported loud explosions and helicopters flying over the Creve Coeur Lake, which is just right near this residential neighborhood. What was that about, Penny?
Well, let's watch. Here's a news report.
Helicopters, gunshots, and explosions. It sounded like a war zone in Maryland Heights last night.
Many of you posted on Facebook wondering what was going on. 5 on Your Side's Grant Bissell learned it was a military secret.
Well, this building used to be part of a psychiatric treatment center for youth in St. Louis County, but last night it became a training ground for Army Special Forces teams. You see those boarded up windows? They had to be covered up after explosions happened here last night, and they sure scared the heck out of people living nearby.
It was kind of alarming.
Margaret Cochran was at home with her husband when she heard the gunshots and explosions echo through her neighborhood around 10 o'clock.
I just came outside the house and looked around, and I didn't see anything.
All right, well, let's stop it there and talk about it. That was the U.S. Special Forces using an abandoned school that was near this suburb of St. Louis as a staging ground for these military war games that were going on.
Right.
So this is, apparently the people in the neighborhood were given zero notice of that.
Yeah,
So,
they put something out on Facebook like 15 minutes before saying there's going to be all these explosions going off, and then they had explosions going until 1 in the morning.
I know. So yeah, what is this about? Well, first of all, we have to say that obviously these war games were done in a white community, but as a white community that is a suburb of St. Louis, and St. Louis is at least 50% African.
Right.
If you're there, I believe that is far more than 50% African.
Yeah.
It's a city that once had a population of 800,000. It was a huge Midwestern city. But during the 1960s, the African Revolution of the 1960s, there was enormous white flight, which is still going on today. And the population went down to 300,000, to just above 300,000 people in that city. So there are large swaths of abandoned properties and lands, and this is something that the African People's Socialist Party has been buying up, some of these abandoned properties, renovating them as part of the Black Power blueprint to bring political and economic power into that community, and it's just receiving an exuberant response there. So it's very, very powerful. I just read the other day that another 4,500 white people left St. Louis in the last 7 or 8 years, moving further out to a town called O'Fallon, which is still in St. Louis County, but about 35 miles away. That is a city that is 87% white and only 4% African. So, St. Louis and Missouri itself are known to be very, very dangerous for African people because of the white nationalist assaults that go on there. In fact, the NAACP a couple of years ago had famously had a travel warning out for African people throughout the state of Missouri because of the danger of these white nationalist groups and individuals attacking African people.
So it doesn't seem like a coincidence that they would be doing war games in the city where the Uhuru movement has been building the Black Power blueprint, has been building a revolutionary center of dual and contending power in the hands of the African working class, and where the African People's Socialist Party is going to have its 7th Congress in St. Louis in just a few weeks. So
yes,
seems pretty
October
obvious what they're doing.
6th to the 12th, 6th to the 12th in St. Louis. You can go to apspcongress.org and find out more about it.
So you mentioned that these war games are happening, and I wanted to see if we could talk about counterinsurgency. And sometimes you hear the word counterinsurgency used to describe, U.S. military operations in other countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. But what is the situation of counterinsurgency here inside the U.S.?
Well, I mean, obviously, counterinsurgency is a well-known tactic of the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, to fight against what they call insurgency, which in fact is the right of oppressed and colonized people to rise up and fight for their freedom and independence. What the U.S. did to the people of Vietnam was counterinsurgency. The people were fighting for their own land and the unification of Vietnam and the return of all its resources and all the foreigners out. What the U.S. has done to Ghana, to Congo, in South Africa, Venezuela, and many other places around the world is counterinsurgency, is a vicious, vicious kind of warfare where it uses everything from psychological warfare, economic warfare, just complete torture, when they want it, as they did in Iraq, as you mentioned there, and other kinds of places. And it's really significant that these war games are happening right around St. Louis, because only 4 years ago, as we know, this was the site where in Ferguson, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, Michael Brown, who was 18 years old, was gunned down by the police in a very vicious way, right in his own neighborhood, very close to the house where he lived. And his body was left out in the hot sun for 4 hours. The African community there rose up in very militant and powerful resistance that went on for months and months, fighting back this terror that African people experienced there, and sparking, similar kinds of resistance all around the country, in Baltimore, Chicago, many other places where this has been happening ever since. And, just bringing up the consciousness of the right of African people to be free, to have Black community control of their own police, to determine their lives and their economy. And, at that time, you and I were out in Ferguson a couple of weeks after this murder of Mike Brown, and you remember what we saw on the streets of Ferguson.
Yep. Tanks and just total counterinsurgency, just total repression of the people there.
Yeah, it was lined with National Guard and other kinds of troops and camo and combat gear with holding major rifles and assault rifles and, all of that going on, as well as armed white groups were there as well. Oh, yeah. So it was counterinsurgency that was going on at that time there.
So I think there's a lot of white people who will see this, who will see these war games, and who'll have this kind of knee-jerk reaction like, this is a police state, this is fascism coming to America. How do you respond to that?
Well, Chairman Omali Yeshitela sums up so clearly in this book and other places, when he's speaking and in this political report that he's been reading every Sunday now for the new Congress, the 7th Congress. He reads his political report on Sundays from 8 to 10 Eastern. You can go to Chairman Omali Yeshitela Facebook page and sign up for that, or to the YouTube page. And, he summed it up really clearly that there's this concern, especially under Trump and certain kinds of ways that Trump is moving. There's this stated fear by white people that there will be fascism, that there will be even military occupation for white people. But the fact is that this has been going on against African people for hundreds of years.
Right.
This is what colonialism means. We look back at the 1960s when the Black Revolution, the African Revolution, just defined the world, and certainly for my generation, it defined what young white people, how we began to see the whole world and to see and stand in solidarity with the right of African people and the Vietnamese and oppressed people around the world to have their freedom and liberation. It was the time, as Chairman said, when revolution was the main trend in the whole world. But inside the U.S. government waged a counterinsurgency best known as COINTELPRO that included the participation of many departments of the U.S. military and CIA and intelligence organizations to attack the African Revolution. Just so many notorious things. The police, the murder of Martin Luther King, of Malcolm X, these were done by the U.S. government and carried out by them, as well as the assault on the Black Panthers in Chicago in the apartment where Fred Hampton was living and where Mark Clark, a Black Panther member from Peoria, Illinois, was there that night. And the police department of Chicago famously bragged that they sent in a force to attack him that could have waged war against Cuba. I mean, they were very clear about it being a counterinsurgency, and they shot through the door. They killed Mark Clark. They drugged. They earlier had an agent drug Fred Hampton, and they gunned him down in his doorway. And when they saw that, they pulled him out of the bed. They laid him in the doorway of his bedroom where he was sleeping next to his 8.5-month pregnant wife. And when they saw that maybe he slightly moved, they shot him again, and they said, he's good and dead now. It was a brutal, brutal counterinsurgency. There are African people like Sundiata Acoli and others who are in prison today from the attack on African people in that period. So this has been going on. This has been going on, and it's just so clear how white people, can see this world only through our own lens as sitting on the pedestal of everybody else, instead of recognizing that in order for us to live our lives in the way that we take for granted, it means war against African people. It means the gunning down of oppressed and colonized peoples all over this world who are fighting for their liberation and freedom.
Right. And I think, what you're saying, that this has already been happening. This is not something that just started with these war games in St. Louis or even with the counterinsurgency in Ferguson, that this is something the U.S. has been involved in since its inception, is counterinsurgency against colonized people fighting to resist. And also, Chairman Omali Yeshitela has shown that this is international, that just as the U.S. is engaged in counterinsurgency against African people and Mexican people and indigenous people inside U.S. borders, they're engaged in counterinsurgency all over the world, and including through AFRICOM, that they're expanding military presence throughout the continent of Africa and doing war games, just like they did in St. Louis. They do war games outside China, they do war games near Iran. They do that to intimidate the people there and to try to show that they're gearing up for war, for open warfare against those countries and those governments and those peoples. So this is what we're seeing. It's international counterinsurgency.
That's right, and I think that it also really illuminates the point that the chairman makes so clearly in this book, that the conditions facing African people in this country is colonialism.
Right.
It looks a little bit different perhaps to us, and it's so easy for us to walk over the bodies of African people sometimes to support oppressed and colonized peoples around the world. And, but the fact is that African people are colonized inside the borders of the United States. Every aspect of the life of an African person in this country is totally different than the life of a white person, regardless of class or anything else. I mean, we have the highest prison population in the entire world. It's 50% African. African people, drugs were imposed onto the African community all over as part of counterinsurgency as well. And African people were criminalized and still are, and locked up in prisons with sentences 500 times greater than white people for drugs and that kind of thing. And now we see practically decriminalization of drugs for white people, not going to prison for that, while African people are still, hugely locked up inside this country for things like marijuana, smoking marijuana and that kind of thing, where it's legal for white people. So there's two different conditions. There's the economic conditions where white people have 22 times the wealth and assets of African people, and they're saying that if things would continue the way they are within the next 10 years, that white people will have 86 times the wealth of African people. African people's wealth is on the decline because the conditions are worsening and worsening under this crisis of imperialism that we're talking about.
So that clearly is much deeper than racism, than a simple question of racism, as Chairman Omali Yeshitela goes into. And just understanding that the problem faced by African people in this country is colonialism and not racism informs African people of their struggle and also informs us as white people of what we have to do. Because assuming that the problem is one of racism, for one, it keeps us in the center. It makes the whole world revolve around us and our ideas and our feelings and our perceptions. And it's based on this idea that, well, if we can be convinced to like black people, then what, these war games are gonna stop happening, or the police are gonna stop killing African people in the streets of this country? Or, we can take an unlearning racism workshop or whatever. Nothing changes. The material conditions don't change. So clearly, this question of colonialism takes us way beyond that, and it takes us to the question of reparations.
Exactly, reparations, and to say first of all that even though again these war games, these special operations forces did this in a white community, but this is targeting African people.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
So part of reparations is our stand to say that we will stand as a buffer against what this government is doing and will do as the resistance grows in this period of the deepening crisis of imperialism, because this system is going down. Everything about it is in crisis, from Trump to the economy to the environment to the inability of the US government to rule in the same old way. And African people are exuberantly excited about the Black Power blueprint going on in St. Louis and all the kinds of Black Star industries that the African People's Socialist Party has in Oakland, California, in Philadelphia, here in St. Petersburg. The party is building in South Africa, just had a major conference there where Africans came to near Johannesburg from all over Africa, also building in Kenya, building throughout Europe. I mean, this consciousness that Africa must be free and that African people are fighting for their liberation is growing and exciting. And for us as white people, we can have a role to play in that. Our role is to go inside the US government and put the clog in the wheel there, because they expect us to have unity with whatever they do and want to do to African people here on the continent of Africa or any other oppressed peoples in the world. And under the leadership of the African Revolution, we can be in the white community as Black power in white face. We can be there winning the understanding of African internationalism and the right of African people to be free and liberated and have their resources back, and bring this understanding to white people as a way that we can be part of the future, not uniting with all of these morbid ideas of just the crisis of imperialism, but we can be part, through our role, through reparations, in this whole plan and strategy for African liberation. So it's a very exciting period.
Indeed, indeed. I totally unite with everything you just said, and just that has to be our stance as white people, is to say that if you are going to try to attack the African liberation movement, the African community, you're going to have to go through us.
Right.
And those white people in that little news clip that we saw earlier, I just think it was disturbing that the stance of a lot of the white people in that town was they were upset about the explosions, and then they found out that they were just military exercises, and they were like, okay, well, it would have been nice to get a little bit of a warning or something like that.
But they have no problem with the
Right.
U.S. military coming
Exactly.
in and doing that.
Yeah, we have to be like, hell no, we're completely opposed to this, and stop the war on the black community and victory to the African resistance.
Uhuru. So we want to let people know that if you want to support the African resistance, if you want to support the Black Power Blueprint concrete projects that are being built by Deputy Chair Ona Zinea-Shatella in St. Louis right now, under the vision of Chairman Omali Shatella, where several properties have been built, they've been renovated through community support, through volunteers and African contractors and white people who have paid reparations to this. You can go to blackpowerblueprint.org, blackpowerblueprint.org. You can donate there, you can give reparations, and you can be part of an amazing, amazing, beautiful project, one of the only positive projects happening in the world today.
This is blackpowerblueprint.org.
Uhuru.
Definitely encourage everyone to go there.
So we want to call on everybody, white people, to join Uhuru Solidarity Movement. Jesse, where can they go for that?
You can go to uhurusolidarity.org, and you can click the button that says Become a Member. It's a red button, or if you want to make a contribution, click Pay Reparations. And I encourage all white people to become members, to become active members of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, building white solidarity with black power under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party.
Uhuru, and we ask you to subscribe to Uhuru Solidarity YouTube channel, get notifications. We do this program at least once a week, if not more, and I think Uhuru Solidarity Movement has hundreds of videos on its YouTube page where you can learn so much about what's going on. Also, we want to call on you to participate tomorrow night, Tuesday, September 18th, and watch Black Power Blueprint Live. We're going to have an amazing, amazing show featuring Chairman Omali Shatella of the African People's Socialist Party and Benjamin Prado, Undersecretary of Union del Barrio. We're going to be talking about Black Power and Chicano Power and the tremendous unity that those two organizations have had for over 30 years, working in solidarity with the right of Mexican indigenous people to their land, which this land belongs to them, and the unity with the right of African people to be liberated and free. And so it's going to be an amazing program, so please watch us at Black Power Blueprint Live on the Black Power Blueprint YouTube channel tomorrow night, 7 o'clock Eastern Time. So that's it. We'll see you next week on the Crisis Report. Unity through
Reparations.
Reparations.